Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Okay. My name is Mike Johnston, and I'm the owner of Morse Telecommunication, the publisher of the Slackware Professional Linux product and the Linux Quarterly CD-ROM. And the organizers invited me here today to speak just a little bit about Linux and what it is, what it does, and what my company does. Mostly, I think, because everyone else of note is either in California or Finland. I first discovered Linux about a year and a half ago on the internet, and I was initially fairly skeptical about its usability because there are an awful lot of things out there that have a lot of promise but usually don't pan out to be what they're touted to be. Well, I've got a pretty good background in system administration, worked with Xenix, System 5, BSD, SCO, and so forth, so I pretty much knew what was involved in putting one of those systems together, and that, I suppose, was the basis of my skepticism. But nevertheless, I downloaded a copy of the original soft landing system version off the internet, and I was fairly surprised. It was a very complete system. It essentially had all the features that I was used to in standard versions of Unix. The compilers were there, X-Windows, development libraries, and most of the other internet tools which had been around for years were already compiled and running under Linux. So essentially, it was a very complete version of the operating system, and I was surprised, to say the least. So I started by putting it on floppy disks, because at the time I think it was about 30 disks worth or so, which was even then still quite a handful, especially if you only have a 9600 baud connection to the internet to download. So little did I know what I was getting myself into, because my phone started ringing, and the next thing I knew I was copying thousands of floppy disks by hand. I didn't have any duplicating equipment or anything, and I wore out quite a number of floppy drives in the process. A little later on, I decided to start putting it on CD-ROM, and not having ever put anything on CD-ROM and not knowing how to do it didn't really stop me. Let me just say that if you really haven't lived until you've put something on a non-erasable media and spent your last $2,000 doing it. Nevertheless, it worked, and I learned pretty quickly how to do that, so we haven't had any problems with our CDs so far. And that's essentially how my company, Morse Telecommunication, got into the Linux publishing business. A little later on, I decided that I felt the operating system was ready, pretty much ready for prime time. It needed better documentation, or at least a more coherent package to be made available to the general user rather than just the internet-connected techie. So what we did was we contacted Patrick Volkening, the author of Slackware Linux, which is currently the most popular version of Linux available on the internet. And we proposed to him that what we would do would be to basically create an official distribution of Slackware and put it on CD-ROM, provide it with documentation, add technical support, which is something I think most people generally expect when they spend $50 or $75 or whatever for a pre-created distribution, which is what we did. So taking it from there, he jumped at the idea, and that was how Slackware Professional, the Slackware Professional product, was born. Slackware Professional is essentially the same version of Linux that you can get on the internet. The key differences with that package are that you can run it directly from the CD-ROM and run it cleanly with using as little as 8 megabytes of a native Linux partition or 11 megabytes of an uncompressed MS-DOS partition. The bulk of the rest of the operating system, X-Windows, the internet stuff, the compilers and all, will run from CD. Of course, the faster the CD-ROM drive you have, the better. You don't want to start compiling kernels with a single-speed CD-ROM drive. So that's what we did. We put that together with the manuals which had been written by the Linux Documentation Project, had them professionally printed and typeset. Decided to beef up our tech support a little bit, added some extra lines, and basically went out and pressed 5,000 of them to start. As of right now, the thing is moving out faster than we can even imagine. I can't even begin to guess the number of users that are currently using Linux actively, whether that's 50,000, 100,000. It's all over the place. And since there's no unified source of getting it, you can get it anywhere you want, and you don't have to register it when you get it. Who knows? There could be 250,000. Estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000. It varies, but it's all over the place, and you'll find it all over the place. So it's out there, and that's what we do basically is we provide it on CD-ROM. We update it frequently. We try and track the bugs that we discover through the customers that call us for assistance. Report those back to the developers. Try and get the documentation enhanced, the aspects of the installation that have problems. We attempt to resolve those difficulties by first determining whether or not it was the user that maybe did something wrong, or if it was the installation process itself. And from there, we communicate that back to the developers and essentially act as a buffer between the developers and the end users so that they don't have to be answering thousands of questions, because as the installed base of Linux users grows, we're finding that the developers and ourselves as well are getting literally hundreds of email messages a day, and that's going to continue to grow. So now that we've at least partially removed the burden of support from Pat Volkerding, the author of Slackware, he's pretty much off chasing the Grateful Dead around Chicago these days. For those who are interested, Bob Young here, the publisher of New York Unix and owner of the ACC bookstore, has a table set up out in the area over there where you can take a look at the Slackware Pro product, as well as some of the other Linux-related products that he's got, the InfoMagic, the Linux Quarterly books, and so forth. Since I seem to spend most of my time these days answering questions on the telephone, I really haven't had a chance to prepare anything long-winded to bore you with today. So at this time, I'll open the floor. We'll take questions about Linux, what it is that my firm does. Maybe you have some technical Linux questions or what have you, and it's up to you. You, sir.
You have a package like Mosaic for accessing the internet?
Mosaic, unfortunately, is not free software. The NCSA doesn't want it redistributed on a CD-ROM without royalties being paid back to the NCSA. We're currently working on licensing that for the CD, but at this time it's not on the CD because of that. There is a Gopher replacement called Lynx, which I actually think is quite better than the original Gopher program. That's on there, so you have Gopher services.
And what about emulation?
Emulation.
Oh, for Windows, for instance, or DOS?
Okay, there is DOS emulator on there called DOS-EMU. Windows emulation is currently being worked on. The project is called Wine, and they have said that there will be no wine before its time. So that's not available yet either. It may be a few months. Apparently it runs some limited MS-DOS applications. I'm very much looking forward to that because operating system sales tend to be driven by applications. In other words, people want to know, does it run Excel, or does it run Word, or does it run their favorite applications? And if it does, they really don't care what the underlying operating system is. But if it offers them more performance or greater advantages, they will choose that. So, does that answer your question? Okay. That gentleman back right there. Okay. The
Colonel Hacker's Guide.
Tried that. They don't have this.
14.5. Okay. Otherwise, it's read the source. So.
Yeah, I would probably say much the same myself. I've never been asked that question. Unfortunately, most of the questions that I get asked generally fall into the how come it doesn't install in my system variety. But we do get various compiler questions and questions in other areas. You might want to try sending Linus himself some email and get a response in 6 months about that. He's one of the people that get a few hundred messages a day. So.
One comment just on what he said, then I've got a question. There's another World Wide Web graphical interface out there called Chimera, which works well. It also doesn't use the motif library, and it's free on the net, so that may be something you want.
Is that a new development? I haven't seen that.
been out there for a
Yeah.
while.
Well, you can get Mosaic, and Mosaic will run under Linux. We just
Is it on Sunside or?
Yeah, Mosaic's on Sunset and Shimmer's on
Yeah.
Sunset also.
You just can't put it on CD-ROM and distribute it that way. That's why it's not on there.
My question though does, and this is for anybody who might know, do you know if there's any development for compatibility in the kernel for PCI?
That's going to come along. I just recently saw an announcement about a week ago for SCSI drivers for PCI. The problem with that is that PCI is still sort of leading edge, maybe not to you and I, but to the people who have to buy the machines, namely the developers, and the developers don't all have PCI machines. We're making sure that Pat Volkerding gets one, but he doesn't write kernel drivers. We try and support the developers of various aspects of Linux, and we support them to that end. Okay.
Can we have a quick show of hands of how many people in the audience are using Linux?
How many people here are using Linux or have tried Linux, I suppose?
Anybody try FreeBSD?
How many people are thinking of trying Linux after today? Okay, so that I guess gets the rest of them. Okay. So.
A question about the differences between the releases of Linux. I know there's an Yggdrasil release. I don't believe it's related to Slackware.
No.
There are many different releases of Linux. What are the advantages?
Okay. There are at least 4 or 5 different versions of Linux distributions that you can download off the internet. The most popular is still the Slackware distribution. Second, and these numbers, or this order I'm giving you is based on the numbers that were published in the Linux Journal a few months ago. It may have changed. I suspect Slackware is even more popular these days because it's gotten easier to install. But with number Slackware, SLS, Soft Landing Systems, which is one of the first comprehensive Linux distributions. Then there is MCC from the Manchester Computing Center, which is more of a stripped-down version, which people use to install as a base system and then build their own Linux system from there. And then there's another version called Debian, which is being worked on right now and is being touted as the next Slackware, supposedly. Now, I may have missed 1 or 2. There are enhancements to that, like the JE enhancements to Linux and so forth. But then there are the commercial distributions, of which there are several. The Yggdrasil distribution, the LGX distribution is one of them. That's a separate and distinct distribution. And I suspect that there is at least 2 more, one from Nascent Technologies, and the other one from, I think, from a company called Red Hat, although I haven't seen anything. That's still to be determined what that is. Yes?
Second part of the question. Now, how is, you know about the interoperability between different releases? Let's say you originally installed your system and you had an Yggdrasil release on kernel, and you download like the new Slackware release, and you decide to buy it. It seems to work. There might be some problems. You know how easy it is, which problems that may occur from going between releases?
What do you mean by combining them into the same file system?
Well, let's say you're upgrading your system and you decide to get like the newest release.
Well, it's better not to, if you're going to switch between major Linux distributions, it's better just to back up the files that you need to save and then install the next one. It would just be too much of a headache. If you want to upgrade your distribution, you can either go out and get the packages you want upgraded piecemeal, which is fine, or get the next version of the distribution. Slackware in recent versions has offered rudimentary upgrade capabilities, so you can upgrade individual packages and so forth. Okay.
Novell was working on a package supposedly with using Linux, I believe, for internet access.
Right. The word on that was, it was more hearsay than anything else. I don't know what the current state of development was. They were going to, the project was codenamed Corsair, I think, and that was written up in PC Week, but nobody, of course, at Novell is saying anything about it. It was going to be based on the Linux kernel, and Bob may have some additional information on that.
Yeah, the story on that, it's actually a very interesting marketing issue, even more than a technology one. What Novell saw was that Linux was a extremely efficient kernel for the PC. They wanted to take advantage of that, and they found they could. They actually first started talking to Linus Torvalds something like 9 months ago about their right to do that, whether that would be okay, and he, of course, said, sure. That's the whole point of the GPL. What happened, though, was they developed this great product. They bought in some outside technology from people like Vuzix Software, their Looking Glass front end to it, and they had this really nifty desktop Unix, basically. But then they ran into the hiccup of, okay, how do you sell it? Here they're out selling Unix, capital UNIX, and how do they then convince people that Unix is a worthwhile product to put on their PC when they're also selling this free product effectively on the PC? And it was their marketing department that could not get their arms around that as a marketing challenge. My take on it, from when I first saw that story, my background is, this is why Michael's answering the technical questions, and I'm here to answer the
Bob's
marketing.
got his ear to the wall all the time.
My take on it was always that this was a great idea, but it didn't make sense to be sold within Novell's structure. It was a product that made perfect sense to spin off from Novell. Apparently, of course, but I won't say that I was brilliant and figured this out, because it's pretty obvious to a lot of people. But apparently, Ray Norda, who was the chief executive of Novell and is recently retired, is now talking about marketing that product as a independent business, unaffiliated with Novell, and that's where the direction to that product is going. Whether it ever happens, we don't know. It's still
Is it aimed at an internet interface?
no. It was aimed at being a Unix for the PC for small users who didn't want to pay AT&T/Novell like licensing fees to get access to the source code. It was aimed very much to take advantage. If you look around this room, the amount of enthusiasm for Linux is directly proportional to the number of people who have either using Unix commercially and need to run it at home, or are advanced DOS Windows users who need what those of us who were in the computer industry before the advent of DOS came along refer to as a real operating system. And that's very much what Novell, particularly Ray Norda, and some of the senior people at Novell realized was the opportunity, if they could build a product around Linux, would be to cater to all of those small businesses and high-end programmers who needed something a little more, have a few more features than DOS Windows gives them. Where it's going to go, we don't know. But we do know Novell has put serious money into it for the last 8-10 months developing this product. This is not straight rumor. There's a real product out there. What's going to happen to it is anyone's guess.
Gentleman in the back. I heard a call for volunteers about 4 months ago on the internet. A bunch of people wanted to put together a report for the power architecture, but
apparently the major manufacturers are donating hardware to these primary developers. DEC have donated to Torvalds a big Alpha machine to port Linux to the Alpha platform. IBM have donated PowerPC units. Whether they went to Torvalds, I'm not sure. But the major manufacturers are seeing all of this enthusiasm from people like the people in this room, and are realizing that they really want in on this bandwagon. So.
Would the IBM be the prep platform, the EREP, which is the PCI bus with big level 2 cache up to 8 megs?
No idea which platform they're talking about.
It wouldn't be the RS6000.
No, it's the PowerPC. It's the one that they're doing in conjunction
that's
with.
already been crippled with AIX.
Okay. Yeah.
Twofold question. One, what is the version of X that comes with it? And two, what are the best graphics cards used with X?
All right, there are actually two major versions of X out there now. The first one is X11R5, which was ported by the X-Free development team. That's in version 2.1.1 right now. That's probably going to remain where it is. They've begun developing X11R6, and in fact, the beta version of X11R6 or X-Free 3.0 is on the latest Linux CDs, the Slackware Pro, the InfoMagic, and so forth. I haven't had the nerve to use it yet. It's still fairly early. Okay.
And what are the best video cards?
Well, video cards, Linux works with a lot of video cards, I'll tell you the one to stay away from. I don't like to wear. The one to stay. You can probably answer this. It's a diamond card, right? I don't know what chipset that's based on. It may very well work. You may not have it configured properly, but the one to stay away from is the Diamond. Diamond refuses to release the specifications for that card or that chipset without a non-disclosure agreement, which means you can't distribute the source to the drivers. So it's catch-22.
Is that X aimed at server or client?
The X Windows? Oh, both. Both. I mean, with the networking capabilities of Linux, I mean, it can act as both. I mean, you've got X clients built in there, which can connect over the net or through the network to an X server or to the local X server, or you've got the server and you can have the clients anywhere on that. I mean, it's like an ordinary Unix system. I mean, you can run, for example, when I worked on Wall Street as a system administrator, one of the first tests I had for Linux was to take a copy of FrameMaker, which runs on a Sun, and run it on the server, and then display it back to the Linux workstation, which it did beautifully. So I was able to run FrameMaker on my Linux box. Okay, sorry.
I just kind of totally off the topic. I'm not really new. I'm new to Linux, but I just bought a Linux CD developers resource. I'm like new to it. I'm just trying to install it. Is that okay to use, or should I buy the wrong one?
Well,
Is that the InfoMagic?
Yeah.
2C, it's a red CD? No, it's very current. It has Slackware 2.0 on it.
It's fine.
Yeah, it'll do your job very
it
well.
would be wrong of me to answer that question since I have a fiduciary interest in my own company. But they're all good. I mean, you can install Linux from every single one of them. Obviously, I'm partial to mine, but any one of them will get you Linux installed. It's just a matter of what's provided with it in terms of documentation, how easy is it to install, and what do you get for after the installation support.
Yeah, Mike, sorry, over here in the red.
Yeah, just in terms of the question asked before about the port to the Macintosh, the Power Mac platform. First, the guy who was in charge of porting the Amiga port to the Mac tried to get technical information on machines from Apple and was basically turned away at the door. They didn't want anything to do with it. So the other manufacturers may be, welcoming.
Well, Apple has its own X to grind with AUX.
Yeah.
That may be why.
But,
No.
actually, they're abandoning other drivers.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Continue.
also but if you were talking about the Power Macs, you wouldn't be porting the Amiga version to it because that's the 68,000.
Right.
You would probably want to do a direct port from the PC version because it's a different chip anyway.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Back to a video card, is it worth getting a 2 megabyte video card, or would it actually use the second megabyte, or?
That's dependent upon the chipset that you've got and whether or not it's supported in the high-res modes that card offers. For example, you don't need more than a meg, I think, if you're going to run 256 colors and 1024 by 768. My math may be off. So if you're going to go beyond that, the card has to support that resolution that would use that much memory, or high color, one or the other. I'm not sure if the X free server goes beyond 256 colors. That's maybe somebody here can answer here. Other than that, you might not. In other words, unless you're using a super high resolution, you might not need all that memory. Okay, this gentleman right here.
Are there any known hardware incompatibilities within Linux that are documented and written down?
Well.
Mention design.
Yeah, not much is written down because the people who discover these things are too busy to worry about writing it down. We generally document it when we have customers call who make it an attempt to install things and they don't work. As to what doesn't work, you're less likely to find a list of what doesn't work than what does work. In terms of PC architecture, it works with most garden variety stuff. Generally, the cheaper it is, the more likely it is going to work, simply because the developers are more likely to have access to that equipment first. That makes sense. It does. Okay, over here.
On the PC platform, the new DX4 chips and the NA chips are becoming a little more popular.
Right.
How well does Linux work with newer chips?
Well, the chips aren't at the issue, really. I have heard of some timing issues, but primarily the problem is that those sorts of chips tend to be run on PCI bus machines. And Linux, again, is developed by people who don't have access to the PCI systems. As a result, there are problems with PCI cards. Notably, I've spoken to a few customers this week who had gateway PCI machines. Their IDE controllers were acting flaky. They actually had to slow them down to ISA emulation mode. It sort of defeats the purpose of PCI. I think PCI is going to be supported. No, I won't say I think it is. I know it will be supported. It does work to a limited extent, but don't expect to use anything in the way of SCSI or other exotic cards at this time. Give it a little bit of time. Now, this gentleman all the way in the back.
What's the status of current user group activity here in New York? Where
I'm sorry, you said user group activity about Linux?
group activity here in the New York area?
Bob, I think, can answer this question.
Yeah, actually, can I get a show of hands? How many people here got an announcement from ACC about this meeting as part of a user group announcement? Oh, well, they did arrive. Okay. Here's what the user group consists of in New York, and until someone comes up with a better one, which I'd be thrilled if someone did, is what we're trying to do is sort of along the lines of Linux in any case, is try and tag into as many other user group activities as we can and other events. So, for example, the Hackers Conference was having a big conference. It's all organized, and we just helped sponsor, drag Michael along to answer questions. So in that sense, this is a New York City Linux user group sponsored event. There will also be a Linux user group sponsored event at Unix Expo in the evening of, I believe it's the Tuesday evening. That'll be October 3rd or 4th. And again, while this is the New York City Linux user group, will take full credit for it. The fact that Bruno Blenheim put on an expo and donated a room and all the rest of it is sort of us taking advantage of it. So on top of that, the announcement that I sent around also included a comment to the effect of, we'd like to have a September user group meeting, but I don't have the time to organize one. Ergo, if anyone in this room wants to organize a September meeting, and the key thing to meetings, even more than finding nationally known Linux people to speak, the key to any meeting, particularly in the New York City area, is to find a room that's accessible.
A room that they'll let us into.
Exactly, that's right. So the issue is, if you know where there's a room and you're prepared to help organize one, sure, let me know, and I'll certainly provide some of the publicity for it. That'd be great.
Okay, the gentleman right back there.
Yeah.
Pretty basic, actually. Most machines these days are equipped to run at any 386 or 486. Generally, I would say 4 meg of RAM, although you can run it with less. You're not going to be able to do much. 4 meg for a minimal installation, 8 meg if you're going to run X Windows, or more. The more the merrier. In terms of disk space, that's heavily dependent upon which distribution you have, how much of it you want to install, and whether or not you're going to run parts of it from the CD-ROM. For example, with Slackware Pro, you can get away with as little as 8 megabytes of a Linux partition or 11 megabytes of an uncompressed DOS partition and run the bulk of it off the CD-ROM. But it can go as high as 200 or 300 megabytes, for all the binaries, the libraries, the fonts, and so forth. So it varies. I think the average distribution from the folks that we deal with tends to be about 80 to 120 meg. Okay. You, sir.
Can you tell me about the differences in version 2.0?
2.0. Well, everything was upgraded, basically. Pat sat on that he didn't sit on it. We were working with him, and it took a while to get all the bugs ironed out between various applications. But essentially, the compiler was upgraded, the kernel was upgraded, X Windows was upgraded, all the major system applications, the tech program, the GoScript interpreter was upgraded, the libraries, the C libraries, even the X libraries, I believe, were upgraded. So everything is new in there. The installation program has been spiffed up. It now offers you options for configuring, your monitor when you're installing. It's gotten a little easier to install, and everything's been updated. So it's on par with everything else that's out there right now. It's not old anymore. Okay, let me just take somebody else, sir. Yeah.
What's happening with storage
Well, Wine is being worked on. Like everything else with Linux, most of it is pretty much volunteer work. It does run some Windows applications, but as of right now, it's really it's not ready for prime time. It's certainly not up to the level that the DOS emulator is right now. I mean, I hear it plays a pretty good game of solitaire, but that's don't expect too much from it. It's out there. You can run basically alpha versions of it or even pre-alpha versions of it, but you're not. I wouldn't trust it, and I wouldn't use it for anything that you planned on having to recover the files with afterwards.
Do they have something like Wabi?
Well, Wine is essentially the Linux version of Wabi. So that's the answer to it. It's being worked on. You can't push it. It's not. Like I said, there will be no Wine before its time, and that's true. When it's ready, it's ready. Sir.
I heard some talk a while ago on some of the Linux news groups that somebody was developed or had developed some motif, some libraries that were compatible with motif libraries.
It was for developing motif applications?
Well, yeah, so you could, even if you didn't go out and, spend $200 on motif, you'd be able to compile motif apps and stuff like that.
It's possible. I haven't heard about it, but then again, I would be surprised if I had known about it or if it were available. It would be in very wide use right now. In fact, Bob is the distributor of Motif, the exclusive distributor of the Sequoia Motif product in the U.S., and I think he might have heard about that too.
There's actually a whole bunch of really good window managers that run on Linux on X Windows.
Well, he's speaking of development, though.
Yeah, exactly. So the catch is, of course, that they are not Motif compatible. And in particular, where we sell a lot of Motif too. I guess my first point is you don't really need Motif unless you're planning on writing applications that you're going to run on Motif systems in the real Unix world, if you like, on Sun and HP versions. And if you're going to do that, then you have to have the Motif window manager. It's really as simple as that. I'm not aware, I don't know if Kurt's aware of any of these products that do much better than that, but that's certainly who we're selling all of our Motif versions to, are people who are taking Motif applications off of a Sun machine, working on them on their Linux box in order to put them back on a Sun machine, and using the GNU C and C++ compilers. That's very straightforward and a very reliable thing to do.
There is at least one effort that I know about ongoing to develop a free Motif clone. I think that that's being sponsored by the folks over at Yggdrasil. I don't know if that's active. I don't know anything about it other than that they said they were doing it. And I have heard other people make mumblings about wanting to do it. Now, whether or not it's happening, I can't say. Well, I just will say that I don't understand what all this fuss is about Motif. OpenLook works just fine, and so do any of the other window managers. I
don't particularly like actually using Motif's window manager. I think it sucks, but there are some applications that are made.
Yeah, you're right. It's application driven.
You need the libraries
You're
to
right.
compile and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that may be some time. Like everything else in the Linux world, if you don't believe it's going to happen, it probably will. Okay, you, sir.
AIX has Smith, the system manager, which is a fairly friendly user interface. Is there equivalent to that?
Not right now, not for Linux. The reason for that, I think, is that most of the people who have used Linux up to this point are either very technical or mostly technical, and consequently, I think they would view that as an affront on their. But having said that, I'm seeing more and more people of less than stellar hacking abilities using Linux. I mean, we're talking about the more average people who are either Unix curious or Internet curious, and Linux gives them both of those things. They can connect to the Internet very readily, and they can learn Unix very readily. It's very cheap or free if they have a high-speed modem. So I suspect that it's just around the corner. That's.
And what about in the remote procedure calls and distributed processing client server concept?
That I couldn't answer. Yeah.
Kurt, do you have an answer for that one?
Dependency libraries are available with Linux. So you can do this on RGC sort of system calls and stuff.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, so in general, actually, this is a point we didn't make earlier, given this is in theory, a user group meeting. If anyone has a better answer for any of the questions that come up, please stick up your hand and wave it around like crazy, and we'd be very interested in hearing from you. The catch with any technology as complex as something like Linux is that at best you're going to be expert in only one corner of the technology, and whoever has spent more time in the other corners is obviously going to have better answers.
I noticed there's some interviews applications.
Excuse me?
There's some interviews-based applications like iBrowse or
Right.
iDrop. Is the interviews going to be distributed as a development environment?
Well, it's already in there, and at least in Slackware, it is. It's available. It's freely available on the internet.
I just saw a couple applications.
Well, all the development tools are in there. Oh yeah, absolutely. Unless you didn't get the complete version. A lot of times people just get the runtime version because they're not interested in doing interview. I mean, there's so many different library and widget sets out there that you go crazy. I don't personally do any X programming. My hair started falling out years ago with C programming. So I pretty much got out of the programming business and stuck with system administration and system integration. I just merged the two words. Okay. You, sir. In this room, it's not very secure at all, I don't think. Well, Linux, because Linux is so widely used, the bugs or the security flaws in Linux are being found fairly quickly. There was one very well advertised one a few months ago, which would get you root access on most any Linux machine prior to a certain version. That's subsequently been fixed. Any Unix system is only as secure as the administrator wants to make it, and if you want to leave loopholes in there, they're in there. For example, the default distributions, most of them offer you the option of installing basically null accounts or accounts like guest with no passwords. Those could be counted as a security hole because most people simply just say yes and install them. I'm sure there's lots of stuff in there and lots of stuff waiting to be discovered, but I don't know. I would say it's probably no less secure than any other version, which isn't saying much.
Does your distribution, Slackware Professional, contain all the binaries as well as the source, or is it just the binaries for
Yeah, we just an interesting anecdote. I got, and I think this is the first time I've mentioned this publicly. The FSF came after us about 4 or 5 months ago. We got a very threatening letter from their attorney indicating that we were not properly distributing the software. In other words, for those in this room that aren't familiar with the GNU public license, it basically requires you to either distribute the binary with the accompanying source or include a written notice that you will supply the source code on demand. We subsequently contacted them and explained to them that wasn't an intentional omission. We were simply mirroring the archive sites, and the archive sites weren't doing a very good job of matching the source code to the existing binaries that they were storing. Subsequent to that, we came out with a Slackware Pro Edition, and the new Slackware has a complete one-to-one correspondence binary to source. The only exception on that was the X Windows system, which by itself, I think the source was well over 100 megabytes. We didn't have the room for that, and the source license for that doesn't require it to be redistributed, and I don't think many people in this room or beyond are really into hacking the X server. That's for the X3 development team. Okay. Are there any other questions?
RAM and hard drive disk limitations, is it the same as DOS, or can you go on to petabytes? And then streams or sockets?
Okay, well, sockets, of course, are in there because Linux is, well, to my mind at least, it looks, from an administrator standpoint, it looks an awful lot like BSD. Excuse me? Streams, I don't think streams are in there, and I doubt they'll be implemented anytime soon. AT&T doesn't have the best name with Unix hackers as a result of some of the things they did with System 5. However, there are a lot of System 5 enhancements to Linux. I mean, the things that weren't too offensive with System 5 found their way into Linux. For example, the system of RC initialization files. It used to be with, even with up till recently, with I think with SunOS, it was just maybe one major RC file in the etc directory, which called a few others. Now there's an entire subdirectory, the rc.d subdirectory. So that's the System 5 RC. Then you have the termlib stuff. You have the System 5 style init. And various other aspects of it, of which I forget. But yeah, it's more a hybrid of System 5 and BSD. Personally, I think from an administrator standpoint, it's more BSD, but I think from a programmer standpoint, oftentimes it behaves a lot like System 5 or POSIX, which tend to start to merge into one another. It's touted as being a POSIX compliant operating system. They make no allowances to either BSD or System 5 when they say what it's compatible with. But if you use it and you've used BSD or System 5, you'll see the differences or the features that have been taken from both. So it's very much a hybrid.
You got RAM and hard drive?
RAM.
There's no 640K limit.
No, there are no limitations, artificial limitations like what DOS imposes with the 640K. The only time you'll see anything like that, and this has been just recently added to the kernel, at boot time, at least with Slack, the latest versions of Slackware, and I suspect it's a kernel thing, it's not a Slackware thing, before the kernel switches into protected mode, it's only limited to, I think, a megabyte of address space. And if the kernel you're using is fairly bloated with excess drivers and other devices, you'll get a message that says, at boot time, which says memory is tight. That's caused a lot of people to worry that maybe they were running out of resources when in fact the message is superfluous because everyone gets it the first time they boot their system because there's always more device drivers in a boot kernel because of the need to be able to recognize as many devices as possible to get Linux installed.
Like 500 megs of RAM possibly?
Put it on your motherboard.
Yeah, I don't see, if your machine supports it, yeah. The hard drives, the only issue with hard drives currently, well, there are two issues with hard drives. The first is a BIOS limitation, a boot limitation. If, for example, you have the bootable portion of Linux installed beyond 1,024 cylinders on your hard drive, you won't be able to boot it. You have to, Linux, once it boots, takes over, and if it's set up right, will properly recognize or interpret the hardware as is. In other words, it doesn't pretty much rely on the BIOS at all. It stays away from that. It doesn't make any assumptions about the hardware. It goes out and checks. Oftentimes I see people will call me up with a problem with their system, and the first thing they'll say is, I tried this under DOS and it worked under DOS. Well, I've seen DOS work with machines that had severely brain-dead RAM, and the minute you boot, well, any version of Unix, not just necessarily Linux, but any version of Unix, it sort of exercises that RAM a little bit better, and they suddenly discover the deficiencies of their system. So compatibility with DOS is really not the litmus test of whether it's going to work with Linux, but Linux, does support, I would say, on whole, more things than DOS does without having to go out and get external device drivers.
No 8 gig limit.
I don't think there is any physical limitation. I mean, if you've got, for example, you can have two SCSI controllers in your system, and you can have as many as 7 devices on each.
No, I meant per drive.
Per drive? That I can't answer. I don't think.
NT will go to petabytes, but DOS is
Yeah, I don't think that's a limitation.
Does anyone else know?
The ext2 file system is limited to 2 gigabytes per partition.
Okay.
Currently, and you can have however many extended partitions you make. I don't know.
It's probably not a good idea to have partitions that large anyway, for safety. Okay. You sir.
How about the extended IDE drives? Does it support them directly?
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet is the answer. Do you know if they have a switch where you can make them unextended IDE drives?
Oh yeah, well, the difference is if you'll only see about 504 meg. So if you got a 1 gig
Right.
IDE drive, you can only use 504
Does the
megabytes.
switch say magic? No magic?
It's drivable, fast.
Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions?
You said a couple of things that made me very curious. You said that in this case, that it was a kernel problem rather than a Slackware problem. Now, I know there are various developers who still like Slackware and still all that, but who is it or what group is it that actually writes this kernel?
Well, the core of the operating system, the kernel, excuse me, was written by Linus Torvalds in Finland. Now, the device drivers are maintained by whomever is brave enough to write a device driver for a particular device winds up supporting it, and then usually it's handed on to someone else. I have no idea how many people are involved directly with the kernel. I know, looking at the recent README files which accompany the latest versions of the kernel, there are literally 100, 200 names in that list, and there's probably more. People who maybe collaborate and then only one person submits the changes.
Collaboration, it's not like just like people just like say that this is the new Linux one.
Oh, no. There's more or less a central registry. The things tend to go through Linus, I think, unless he's got somebody else managing that now. But basically, things get registered with him, and he'll put it into the official kernel. Now, that said, there are other changes to the kernel which can be added. And ordinarily, if Linus doesn't decide to put them in the kernel, you'll find them on the side. For example, let's say Linus decided not to include this, so it'll be on the FTP site, maybe in the alpha or beta directories, and they can be installed. Ordinarily, though, they are very specific to a given revision number of the kernel, and if you try installing them on some other revision, it's a crapshoot. So getting into the kernel is probably the best way of seeing it, continue on.
Mike?
Still kind of administrative.
Yeah. If you have any closing remarks, then you're right, but fine.
Oh, okay.
Which I gather I know fits with your schedule as well. If you want, I can chat for a couple of minutes as well.
All right, well, we're about to get kicked out. But
Having said
I think
that, sorry.
Go ahead, Bud.
Here, do you want why don't I take over and how
right.
long are you around for?
Oh, I don't have to leave until 6.
Okay, here, why don't I take over for a second?
All right, this is...
Given that we're about to get kicked out and this is a user group meeting, let's meet outside. People like Kurt, how do you pronounce your last name, Kurt? Hockenberry, as well as Michael Johnson will be around outside to, you can debate technical questions with. Before, though, we get kicked out, if you had a couple of questions, I just wanted to do my own curiosity on the thing. Of the people who are using Linux, how many people got it down off the net? Okay. Now, another interesting one that I keep fielding constantly is how many people are considering, or either are using Linux or are considering using Linux in some form of professional environment. By that, and I'm talking broadly defined, either as selling services by connecting people to the net or connecting machines onto their Unix network at work or that kind of thing. Interesting. This is, in general, again, being in the marketing business of PC Unix products and Linux generally, it's the constant skepticism we get of high-end users saying, yeah, but it's not really a professional product and people aren't really using it for mission-critical applications. And what's fascinating, just as a little anecdote that some of you may have heard already, I was out at Uniforum in March, walking by the IDG, people who publish Computer World, who do a lot of market research, and this woman jumps out from behind the counter, sees my badge, at that time saying Linux Journal, and says, "What do you know about this Linux stuff?" And so we chatted for a bit. She apparently was in charge of a survey that IDG do every couple of months of use of various different versions of Linux of Unix, that is, in commercial accounts. So they send these out to vice presidents of MIS, these sort of places. And she got a significant write-in component of these MIS directors admitting to using Linux as their new operating system that they were implementing on their Unix networks.
Came out of the closet.
Exactly, and she was absolutely amazed. So she was asking me things like, well, who's selling this stuff and where is it advertised? And what's the 1-800 number for their marketing department? And I tried to explain to her that it was, well, Linus Torvalds is in charge of the kernel, and various other guys are in charge of different parts of it. And okay, so what's their phone number? And trying to explain to her that she needed an internet connection to get a hold of these people. But it's probably the most interesting aspect of Linux is the stuff really works. It's really stable on the PC, and it's showing up literally everywhere. So if you can't get your questions answered by Kurt or Michael or someone else here, you can certainly get your questions answered out on the net in the Linux news groups, comp.os.linux.announce, MISC, help, and development. And then, of course, there's the Linux Journal, and then there's user groups literally all over the country springing up.
20 different answers.
That's true. But that's been true with Unix all along, I think. Okay, well, thanks very much for coming, and thank you, Michael, for speaking.
I'm a administrator in college, and
I don't know if I should say that. I don't know if you know